The morning sun filtered through the tall courthouse windows, casting long shadows across the marble floor. Sarah Mitchell stood silently in the courthouse hallway, her navy blue dress hanging loosely on her thin frame. At 14 years old, she looked younger, diminished by the weight of circumstances far beyond her control. Her hand trembled as she held Max's leash, a weathered brown leather strap connected to one of the most beautiful golden retrievers anyone had ever seen. Max was 3 years old, with a coat that gleamed like burnished honey and eyes that seemed to understand human suffering in ways that explanation. Sarah had stopped speaking to her mother 6 months ago, not gradually, not as a teenage rebellion, but suddenly, like a switch had been flipped inside her brain. One day she'd responded with monosyllabic teenage grunts. The next day, nothing. Complete silence whenever her mother was present. The silence had become so profound that it had become the central issue of her parents' custody battle, eclipsing even the original reasons for the divorce. The courthouse corridors were sterile and intimidating, painted in institutional beige with flickering fluorescent lights that made everything look slightly unreal. The air smelled of floor wax and desperation. Sarah had been to this building 4 times in the past 18 months. Each visit left her feeling hollowed out, as if they were extracting pieces of her soul with every hearing. Max's presence was the only thing anchoring her to reality. The dog's warm body against her leg was like a lifeline. Her father, James Mitchell, approached from the end of the hallway. He looked exhausted. At 48 years old, he'd aged a decade in the past year and a half. His dark hair had streaks of premature gray, and the lines around his eyes seemed permanently etched. He wore a navy suit that hung on him like it belonged to someone else. Behind him walked his attorney, David, a sharp-eyed lawyer in his 50s who'd been instrumental in fighting what James considered the most unfair custody battle in modern history. "How are you doing, sweetheart?" James asked, kneeling down to Sarah's eye level. He didn't try to make her speak. He'd learned that much over the past 6 months. Instead, he simply placed his hand on her shoulder and looked into her eyes. Sarah's eyes, once bright green and full of teenage sass, were now dull, guarded old. She gave him the smallest nod, and that nod contained volumes. "I'm here. I'm terrified. I don't know how much more I can take." Max immediately moved closer to her, sensing her anxiety spike. The dog's intuition was remarkable. It was as if Max could read the electrical signals of her nervous system. Whenever Sarah's stress levels climbed, Max would press his entire body against her leg, providing what therapists call deep pressure stimulation. It was a grounding technique, a way of saying, "You are still here. You are still real. I've got you." "Judge is handling this one," David said quietly. "She's no nonsense. She doesn't tolerate drama, but she also has a reputation for actually caring about what's best for children. That's in our favor." James nodded, but his jaw was clenched. "What's saying this time?" he asked. David's expression darkened. "She's claiming Sarah's depression is worsening, that she's showing signs of suicidal ideation, and that Sarah needs intensive maternal involvement and therapy. She's positioning herself as the only one who can help Sarah through this crisis." The words hit Sarah like physical blows. Suicidal ideation. She wasn't suicidal, she was just silent. There was a difference that nobody seemed to understand. Her silence wasn't a scream for help or a cry of despair. It was a necessary protective mechanism. When her mother spoke in that particular tone, the one that had destroyed her family, something short-circuited in Sarah's throat. The words wouldn't come. They literally couldn't come. It was like her vocal cords had locked themselves shut to protect her from the pain. "That's completely unfounded," James said, though his voice wavered slightly. "She laughs with me at home. She talks to her friends. She was perfectly fine during our last evening together. She helped me cook dinner, and we talked about everything from her upcoming history test to—" "I know," David interrupted gently. "But narrative is powerful. Courts are afraid of missing warning signs. She's essentially positioning herself as the caring parent trying to save a troubled child." A court officer appeared at the far end of the hallway. "Courtroom 7. Everyone in courtroom 7." Judge is ready to begin. Sarah's entire body went rigid. Max immediately sensed the spike in her cortisol levels and pressed even harder against her. She wrapped her fingers in his fur, seeking comfort from the one being in this building who loved her unconditionally. James placed his arm around her shoulders, and David led the way toward the courtroom. The courtroom itself was intimidating: wood paneling, a high ceiling, the judge's bench elevated like a throne, and an American flag in the corner. It was designed to inspire respect and fear in equal measure. Sarah's mother, Mitchell, was already seated on the left side of the gallery. At 46, had always been beautiful, but lately her face had hardened into something sharper and more predatory. Her hair was perfectly styled, her makeup immaculate, her designer suit expensive. She looked like a woman winning at life. She didn't look like someone actively destroying her daughter. When saw Sarah, she smiled, a calculated smile that didn't reach her eyes. She waved as if they were passing each other at a shopping mall rather than entering a legal battle that would determine Sarah's future. Sarah's grip on Max's fur tightened. The dog made a low, rumbling sound in his throat, not aggressive but protective. Max had learned to recognize smile as a threat indicator. Judge entered from a side door, her black robes flowing behind her like the wings of a predatory bird. She was in her 60s, with steel gray hair pulled back in a tight bun and sharp gray eyes that seemed to miss nothing. She'd been a judge for 23 years and had handled more custody cases than she could count. But something about this particular case seemed to capture her attention immediately. Her eyes landed on Sarah and Max. She watched as the girl clutched the dog's fur while trying to make herself physically smaller, as if she could disappear if she just hunched down far enough. Judge's expression was unreadable, but something flickered behind her eyes, concern, perhaps, or a question that had just been formed. "All rise," the court officer announced, though everyone was already standing. Judge took her seat and adjusted her microphone. She reviewed the thick file before her, occasionally glancing up at the courtroom. When her eyes landed on Sarah for the second time, they lingered. She seemed to be studying not just the girl, but the way Max positioned himself, the way Sarah's breathing synchronized with the dog's, the way their connection transcended ordinary pet-owner relationships. "This is the final custody hearing in the matter of Mitchell versus Mitchell," Judge began, her voice clear and authoritative. "I've reviewed all prior documentation, psychological evaluations, and testimony. Before we proceed today, I want to make one thing very clear. This court's primary concern is the welfare of the child, Sarah Mitchell. Everything else is secondary." She paused, letting that statement settle over the courtroom like a weight. "I see we have a dog in the courtroom," Judge continued, turning her attention to the bailiff. "Is there a reason for this animal's presence?" James's attorney stood. "Your Honor, Max is an emotional support animal for Sarah. We believe his presence is crucial to her ability to participate in these proceedings." Judge studied Max with interest. The dog sat perfectly still, his intelligent eyes watching the judge with an almost human awareness. "Very well," she said finally. "The dog may remain. Now let's begin." As proceedings commenced, Judge continued to observe Sarah, not just her words or demeanor, but the way she moved, the way she breathed, the way she and Max communicated in that strange, silent language that seemed to exist between them. A question was forming in the judge's mind, a question that would eventually crack this entire case wide open. The real story was about to begin. The courtroom fell into a heavy silence as Judge opened the proceedings. The bailiff called the first witness, Mitchell. She rose from her seat with practiced grace, smoothing her designer skirt and offering the courtroom a composed smile. As she walked toward the witness stand, her heels clicked against the marble floor with deliberate precision, the sound of someone who wanted to be noticed. Was sworn in, her right hand raised, her left hand placed on the Bible. She spoke the oath clearly and confidently, as if she'd rehearsed it 100 times. Judge watched this performance with an expression that gave nothing away, though her pen hovered over her notepad, ready to record anything significant. "Ms. Mitchell," David began, standing to address his opposing party's opening statement, "can you describe for the court the current state of your relationship with your daughter, Sarah?" His face transformed into an expression of practiced sadness. "Your Honor, it's been heartbreaking," she began, her voice trembling just enough to convey emotion without breaking down completely. "Sarah and I were always close. We did everything together, shopping, movies, talking about boys and school and life. We had that special bond that mothers and daughters share." She paused, letting that image sink in. "But ever since the separation, she's completely withdrawn from me. She won't speak to me. She won't look at me. Sometimes she won't even be in the same room as me." Judge's eyes narrowed almost imperceptibly. She was listening not just to the words but to the delivery, the careful modulation of his voice, the strategic pauses, the way she seemed to be performing for the courtroom rather than simply describing facts. "When did this withdrawal begin?" David asked. Didn't hesitate. "About 6 months ago. It started gradually and then suddenly it became complete silence. I've been terrified that she's suffering from severe depression, possibly even suicidal ideation. I've tried everything: family therapy, individual therapy for her, medication recommendations from our doctor. Nothing has worked." In the gallery, Sarah's entire body went rigid. Max immediately sensed the spike in her anxiety. The dog's ears swiveled toward and his body tensed. But more remarkably, Max rose to his feet and moved closer to Sarah. He didn't bark or growl. Instead, he performed an action that seemed almost choreographed. He pressed his entire body weight against Sarah's right leg, leaning into her with his full muscular frame, and then he placed his paw firmly on her lap. It was a gesture that everyone in the courtroom recognized instinctively as protective, grounding, and deeply emotional. Several people shifted uncomfortably. Judge's pen stopped moving mid-word, and her eyes locked onto Max with sharp interest. Continued, oblivious to or deliberately ignoring the dog's behavior. "I'm very concerned that James has been enabling her withdrawal. He allows her to stay silent, to isolate herself. I believe she needs a parent who will push her to communicate, to seek help, to get better. I'm that parent. I'm the one who's been trying to fight for her mental health." "That's interesting," David said, his voice taking on a subtle edge. "Because according to the psychological evaluation filed with this court, Sarah exhibits selective mutism only in your presence. She communicates normally with her father and her peers. Can you explain that?" His composure flickered for just a moment, barely perceptible, but Judge caught it. "That evaluation was conducted early in the process," countered smoothly. "The situation has deteriorated significantly since then, and frankly, Sarah may be performing for her father. Teenagers are very good at hiding their true emotional state." Sarah's breathing had become shallow and rapid. Max, recognizing the signs of impending panic, intensified his pressure against her leg. The dog's eyes remained fixed on with an intensity that bordered on unsettling. It was as if Max understood exactly who was causing Sarah's distress and had designated himself as her physical and emotional barrier. David pressed on. "Ms. Mitchell, during the most recent overnight visitation with you last month, Sarah's father reported that you had an extended phone conversation about child support payments. He said your voice could be heard throughout the house. Is that accurate?" "I may have raised my voice," admitted, but her defensive tone suggested this was a minor detail. "But that had nothing to do with Sarah. That was between James and me." "Did Sarah hear this conversation?" "Possibly, but—" "Yes or no, Ms. Mitchell?" His jaw tightened. "Yes, but children need to understand that parents have disagreements. It's a normal part of life." Judge made a note, and Sarah could see her writing something significant based on the way the judge's hand moved across the paper. Sarah felt a tiny spark of hope flicker in her chest, but she quickly extinguished it. Hope had only disappointed her before. James's attorney continued. "After that phone call, what was Sarah's behavior like?" She was upset, admitted reluctantly. She went to her room. For how long? I don't recall exactly. Several hours. And during those several hours, did you attempt to interact with her, to comfort her? His face flushed slightly. I tried, but she wouldn't open her door. Did you continue to speak, or did you give her space? There was a pause, a pregnant pause that filled the courtroom with tension. I may have continued speaking to her through the door, finally admitted. I was trying to explain my perspective on the divorce, to help her understand that her father wasn't being reasonable. The courtroom seemed to inhale collectively. Even some of supporters in the gallery shifted uncomfortably. Judge's pen flew across her notepad, documenting every word. Sarah's entire body had begun to tremble. Max's protective posture intensified further. The dog was now pressing so heavily against Sarah that she could feel every muscle, every heartbeat, every protective instinct radiating from the animal. It was as if Max was saying, I know what happened. I know you're reliving it. You are safe now. I won't let anything hurt you. Sarah's hand shot out, finding Max's fur without looking. She buried her fingers in his coat, anchoring herself to his presence. Several members of the courtroom noticed this interaction. The way the dog seemed to understand exactly what Sarah needed, the way their communication transcended species and language. Ms. Mitchell, David continued, are you aware that Sarah has been diagnosed with selective mutism, a condition where individuals are unable to speak in certain situations despite being able to speak in others? The therapist mentioned something about that, said dismissively, but I think it's just Sarah being stubborn. There it was, that word, stubborn. Judge's expression hardened visibly. One final question, David said. In your opinion, if Sarah were to remain in your primary custody, what specific steps would you take to address her selective mutism? Seemed prepared for this. I would continue therapy, obviously. I would also establish firm boundaries about communication. I would require her to speak to me daily, to participate in family activities, and to be more proactive about her mental health. Sometimes children need structure and boundaries to overcome their issues. Even if that structure and boundaries are causing the anxiety that creates the selective mutism in the first place. Objection, Saturni called out, though the objection seemed weak. Sustained, Judge said, but her eyes communicated clearly that she understood David's point completely. As stepped down from the witness stand, she gave Sarah a smile, the same calculated smile from the hallway. But this time, something different happened. Max stood to his full height, his entire body rigid, and he made a low, growling sound that didn't quite constitute a bark but communicated fierce disapproval. Judge didn't reprimand the dog. Instead, she simply watched, understanding slowly dawning across her face. This dog wasn't just an emotional support animal. This dog was a witness. And what he was witnessing told a story far more complex than anything Mitchell had just claimed. The judge made another note, and Sarah could see 3 words written in capital letters: selective mutism cause. The real investigation was about to begin. After the lunch recess, the courtroom reconvened with a palpable shift in energy. Judge had spent the break reviewing additional documents, and her expression suggested she'd uncovered something troubling. The gallery was more crowded now. Word had spread that this custody case was anything but routine. Several court observers and even a law student sat in the back, interested in what seemed to be an unusual family law matter. The bailiff called Sarah Mitchell. The courtroom fell silent. Sarah's entire body seemed to compress into itself, making her already small frame appear even smaller. James placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder and she rose on unsteady legs. Max rose with her, the leash still in her hand. The bailiff started to object, but Judge held up her hand before he could speak. The dog may approach the witness stand, Judge said quietly. Her decision suggested she already understood something about the relationship between girl and dog that transcended typical courtroom protocol. Sarah walked toward the witness stand with Max at her side, moving as if walking through water. Her legs felt weak, disconnected from her body. The walk seemed to take forever, though it was probably only 15 seconds. Every eye in the courtroom was on her, her mother's eyes sharp and assessing, her father's eyes filled with gentle concern, Judge's eyes analytical and probing. Sarah was sworn in. The bailiff held the Bible toward her, and Sarah placed her hand on it with trembling fingers. "Do you solemnly swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?" Sarah's mouth opened, but no sound emerged. She tried again. Nothing. It was as if her vocal cords had turned to stone. She nodded instead, a gesture that seemed pathetically inadequate in a courtroom designed for spoken testimony. "You may sit," Judge said gently. Sarah sat in the witness chair, and Max immediately curled at her feet, his body pressed against the base of the chair. The courtroom observers leaned forward slightly, sensing that something unusual was about to unfold. David, Sarah's father's attorney, approached with careful slowness. "Sarah, I know this is frightening. I'm going to ask you some simple questions and you can take your time answering. Is that okay?" Sarah nodded. Her hands gripped the edge of the chair so tightly that her knuckles turned white. "How old are you, Sarah?" F. Sarah's mouth formed the words, but they wouldn't emerge. She swallowed hard, tried again. 14, she finally whispered, her voice so quiet that the court reporter leaned forward to hear. "And where do you currently live?" "With Dad on Maple Street." The responses were short, halting, but they were words. Judge was making notes, observing how Sarah's body language shifted with each question. "How often do you see your mother?" Sarah's entire frame went rigid. Her fingers gripped the chair even more tightly. Every other weekend." The words were fragmented, squeezed out like they were causing physical pain. "And how do those visits usually go?" Sarah's breathing became shallow and rapid. Judge noticed immediately and held up her hand. "The witness needs a moment," she said, and there was something almost protective in her tone. Sarah closed her eyes. At her feet, Max began to perform a subtle action. His body pressed against her legs with rhythmic pressure, almost like he was breathing in sync with her, trying to regulate her nervous system through physical contact. After perhaps 30 seconds, Sarah's breathing began to normalize slightly. "I can continue," Sarah whispered. David proceeded carefully. "When you're at your mother's house, how do you feel?" Sarah opened her mouth, closed it, opened it again. "Scared," she finally managed. The word was barely audible, but it reverberated through the courtroom like a gunshot. In the gallery, suddenly sat up. "That's not true," she said loudly enough for several people to hear. "I've never given her any reason to be scared." Judge's eyes snapped toward, and her expression could have frozen fire. "Ms. Mitchell, you will remain silent. You will have your opportunity to respond." She turned back to Sarah. "Continue." "When Mom talks about Dad, something happens in my chest," Sarah struggled to explain. "And my throat closes up. I can't make the words come out." "Has your mother talked about your father to you often?" Sarah's jaw clenched. "During every visit, she says she says bad things about him. She says I have to choose sides. She says he doesn't really love me, that he just wants to hurt her through me." The courtroom erupted in uncomfortable murmurs. Judge called for silence, but her eyes remained fixed on Sarah with an expression that suggested she was seeing something crucial for the first time. Attorney stood. "Objection. Hearsay. The child is repeating what she claims her mother said without the mother having the opportunity to clarify." "Overruled," Judge said sharply. "This is family court, not a criminal trial. The child's perception of her environment is relevant to her welfare." David continued. "Sarah, when you're at your father's house, can you speak normally?" "Yes." The word came out without hesitation, with more confidence than Sarah had shown all day. Can you give me an example of something you've talked about with your father recently? Sarah's shoulders relaxed minutely. We cooked dinner together last week. We made his famous pasta, and we talked about my history project and about how my friend asked if I wanted to go to the school dance. Dad helped me figure out what to say too. The contrast was stark. In that description, Sarah's voice had become almost animated. She'd spoken in complete sentences without struggling. The courtroom understood instantly. This girl could speak. She simply couldn't speak to or about her mother without her body shutting down. Now it was Saturni's turn to cross-examine. He approached with an air of skepticism. Sarah, isn't it true that teenagers often say they're scared of parents when they're actually just upset that the parent is enforcing discipline? Sarah's entire body tensed again. Max's head lifted, his ears swiveling toward the attorney. No, Sarah said quietly. When Mom enforces discipline, she raises her voice. She uses a certain tone. That tone makes me feel like— She paused, searching for words. Like something terrible is about to happen. Like what kind of terrible thing? Sarah struggled visibly. Like she might hurt someone. Like everything is falling apart. Like I have to choose between my parents, and if I choose wrong, someone will die. The courtroom seemed to hold its collective breath. Judge's pen was moving rapidly across her notepad. You think your mother might hurt someone? No, I don't know, not physically, but emotionally, her words, they hurt. Saturni pressed on. So you're basically saying you don't like your mother's parenting style, and you've decided to punish her by refusing to speak. Isn't that accurate? Sarah shook her head vigorously. I don't want to punish anyone. I can't speak. I try and my throat closes up. It's not a choice. I don't want to not speak to her. But you can speak to your father and to other people. Yes. Isn't that convenient? It was a vicious question, designed to make Sarah's selective mutism seem intentional and manipulative. Sarah's face crumpled. Her hands began to shake so violently that she had to grip her lap. Her breathing became rapid and panicked again. And that's when it happened, the moment that would change everything. Max rose to his full height with a grace and purpose that seemed almost supernatural. He didn't bark or growl or display any aggression. Instead, he walked directly to the witness stand, placed his front paws on the railing, and locked his entire body into a rigid position. His eyes were fixed directly on Sarah's face, and he held that position, intense, unwavering, completely still, for what felt like an eternity but was probably only 5 seconds. Sarah's hand shot out instinctively, touching Max's head twice in rapid succession. Then she nodded, a clear, definitive nod that was visible to everyone in the courtroom. The gesture was so profound, so clearly a form of communication between girl and dog that transcended language, that the entire courtroom seemed to freeze. Even Judge's pen stopped moving. Several observers gasped audibly. It was as if Max had performed a miracle, as if he'd somehow translated Sarah's emotional devastation into a visible, undeniable demonstration of her genuine distress. Judge's eyes widened. She leaned forward, studying both girl and dog with an intensity that suggested she'd just witnessed something that rewrote her entire understanding of this case. The witness will step down, Judge said quietly, but her voice contained a note of urgency. I think we all need a 15-minute recess. As Sarah stood on shaking legs, Max remained pressed against her side, his protective presence a physical manifestation of their unbreakable bond. Judge had seen enough. The real investigation was about to begin. Judge's chambers were located on the 3rd floor of the courthouse, accessible by a private elevator that only judges and their staff could use. She retreated there immediately after calling the recess, her mind churning with what she'd witnessed in the courtroom. The dog's gesture, that unmistakable moment of communication between Sarah and Max, had triggered something in her judicial instincts. Something was deeply wrong with this case, and she was beginning to suspect that she'd misunderstood it from the very beginning. Her chambers were lined floor to ceiling with law books, case files, and legal precedents accumulated over 2 decades of judicial service. A large mahogany desk dominated the center of the room, cluttered with documents from various cases. Judge sat down and immediately pressed the intercom button. "I need the complete file for Mitchell versus Mitchell, everything, and I need it now," she said tersely. Her clerk, a woman in her 60s who'd worked with Judge for 15 years, appeared within minutes carrying a thick accordion folder. Knew the judge well enough to understand that the tone in her voice meant something significant had occurred. "Is there a problem, Your Honor?" asked cautiously. "I'm not sure yet, but I think we may have missed something critical. Can you pull the psychological evaluation that was submitted 6 weeks ago, the one conducted by Dr. Sarah's fingers flew across her tablet. "Here it is, filed on September 3rd with supplementary notes dated September 8th. Do you want me to retrieve the original or print it? I want to read it physically. Something about this case isn't adding up, and I want to read every word carefully." 20 minutes later, Judge sat alone in her chambers, reading the psychological evaluation with intense focus. The document was 12 pages long, and it had been submitted to the court before the previous hearing. Yet somehow, in the mountain of paperwork that accumulated in custody cases, it seemed to have been filed and forgotten rather than thoroughly analyzed. The first 5 pages contained standard psychological assessment information: Sarah's medical history, developmental milestones, family background before the divorce. The 6th page was where things became interesting. Patient exhibits selective mutism in maternal presence. Speech is fluent and age-appropriate with paternal figure and peers. No evidence of global communication disorder. Language development appears normal. Reading and comprehension skills are advanced for age. Judge's pen hovered over the page. She continued reading. Patient demonstrates clear anxiety response when discussing maternal figure. Heart rate increases measurably. Breathing becomes shallow. Patient exhibits classic fight or flight physiological responses. When discussion shifts to paternal figure or neutral topics, anxiety symptoms resolve completely. Patient becomes animated and verbal. The judge made a note: selective triggered. The next paragraph contains something even more significant. Preliminary clinical impression. Patient's selective mutism appears to be a manifestation of anxiety disorder triggered specifically by maternal presence or discussion of maternal figure. This is not a global developmental disorder, but rather a situational response to environmental stressor. Recommend comprehensive trauma assessment. Possible indicators of emotional abuse, though patient demonstrates reluctance to discuss specific incidents. Patient appears protective of maternal figure, which is common in abuse situations where child has been conditioned to minimize or conceal parental behavior. Judge sat back in her chair, her eyes widening. Emotional abuse. The words seemed to jump off the page. She pulled out her own laptop and searched for selective mutism in medical databases. What she found was eye-opening. Selective mutism was not, as had suggested, a form of stubbornness or manipulation. It was a recognized anxiety disorder, often resulting from trauma, abuse, or overwhelming stress. Children with selective mutism experienced actual physical inability to speak in triggering situations, their vocal cords effectively paralyzed by anxiety. It wasn't voluntary. It wasn't a choice. It was their nervous system's way of protecting them from overwhelming emotional pain. Judge pulled up the video footage from Sarah's testimony that morning. She watched Sarah struggling to speak, watched the way her body tensed when certain questions were asked. Then she watched the moment, the extraordinary moment, when Max pressed his body against the witness stand and locked eyes with Sarah. She watched Sarah's hand touch the dog's head twice, watched her nod with clear, definitive intent. That gesture, that communication, it was the most genuine thing Judge had seen in this entire trial. The dog understood something fundamental about the girl that everyone else had missed. The dog understood that Sarah's silence was not a problem to be fixed through discipline or structure. It was a symptom of something deeper, something traumatic. Judge opened her email and typed a message to Dr. Sarah, the psychologist who'd conducted the evaluation. "Doctor, I'm Judge from the district courthouse. I'm reviewing your psychological assessment of Sarah Mitchell from September. I have several questions about your preliminary findings, particularly regarding the selective mutism diagnosis. Would you be available for a brief phone consultation this afternoon? This is a time-sensitive matter." The response came within 10 minutes. "Judge, I would be happy to speak with you. I've been concerned about this case. I recommended a trauma assessment, but I wasn't sure if the recommendation had been acted upon. I can call you in 5 minutes." Judge's phone rang at 2:47 p.m. She answered immediately. "Doctor, thank you for calling so promptly," Judge began. "I've been reviewing your assessment of Sarah Mitchell. You mentioned emotional abuse as a preliminary indicator. Can you elaborate on what you observed?" "Your Honor, I want to be careful about making accusations, but Sarah demonstrated classic patterns consistent with emotional abuse exposure. When discussing her mother, she became extremely anxious. When I asked about specific incidents, she became evasive and said she didn't want to hurt her mother's feelings. That's a major red flag. Abused children often take responsibility for protecting their abuser. But you never actually documented specific abusive incidents." Sarah wouldn't discuss them. She was protective of her mother, which made direct documentation impossible. However, the physiological responses don't lie. When I mentioned the mother's name, Sarah's cortisol levels spiked measurably. Her breathing became shallow. Her pupils dilated. Her body was telling me something her words wouldn't confirm. Judge was making rapid notes. "In your professional opinion, could selective mutism develop as a specific response to a particular person or situation?" "Absolutely. Selective mutism isn't really about being unable to speak in general. It's about being unable to speak in the presence of specific triggers. For some children, it's public places. For others, it's specific people. In Sarah's case, all evidence points to the mother being the primary trigger. If the child were to remain primarily with the trigger, the mother, what would be the likely trajectory of her condition?" There was a pause on the other end of the line. "It would likely worsen significantly, Your Honor. Without removal from the stressor, the anxiety would compound. The selective mutism could expand to other areas of her life. We could see depression, potentially self-harm, increased isolation. Essentially, her mental health would deteriorate substantially." Judge felt a chill run down her spine. She'd almost made a decision that could have caused serious, lasting psychological damage to this child. "One more question, Doctor. In your professional opinion, does this girl's condition require specialized therapeutic support?" "Yes. She needs trauma-informed therapy, anxiety treatment, and most importantly, she needs to be removed from the triggering environment. She also clearly has a strong attachment to an animal. I see that mentioned in the case file. That animal may be providing essential emotional regulation. I would not recommend separating them." After the call ended, Judge sat in silence for several minutes. Her entire understanding of this case had shifted. Sarah wasn't a troubled, depressed child who needed her mother's firm guidance. Sarah was a traumatized child whose selective mutism was a direct response to emotional abuse, and that mutism would likely worsen if she remained in her mother's primary custody. But there was something else, something she'd seen in the courtroom that no evaluation could fully capture. The way Max had positioned himself, the way the dog seemed to understand Sarah's emotional state with almost supernatural accuracy, the way their communication transcended species and language. That bond was therapeutic. That bond was healing. Judge pulled up the file again and searched for information about Max. Adoption records, shelter documentation, any history of training or behavioral assessment. What she found made her lean back in her chair with a sense of revelation. Max had been trained as an emotional support animal. The dog possessed genuine therapeutic capabilities. In a way, Max was already functioning as Sarah's therapist, better, perhaps, than any human professional could. The dog seemed to understand her anxiety triggers, could sense her physiological distress, and knew exactly how to provide grounding and pressure stimulation. Judge made a decision right then and there. She pressed the intercom again. "I need you to do something for me. I need comprehensive documentation on the conditions and symptoms of selective mutism. I need medical literature. I need case precedents. And I need it all before we reconvene in 1 hour." "Yes, Your Honor, right away." As hurried to comply, Judge leaned back in her chair and stared at the ceiling. She'd been wrong. Not just wrong about which parent should have custody, but fundamentally wrong about the nature of Sarah's condition. The girl's silence wasn't a problem. The silence was a message, a desperate, wordless plea for help that only one being in the courtroom had truly understood. And that being had 4 paws and the most intelligent eyes Judge had ever seen in an animal. The real investigation was about to begin, and Judge was going to get to the bottom of this, no matter what it took. Judge's chambers were far less intimidating than a courtroom, but Sarah still felt terrified as a court officer escorted her through the private elevator. Max remained at her side, his presence the only thing anchoring her to reality. The judge had made an unprecedented decision, a private meeting with Sarah without attorneys present. The decision itself was unusual enough to spark concern among the legal professionals in the hallway, though no one dared question the judge's authority. When Sarah entered the chambers, the first thing she noticed was that it didn't look like a courtroom at all. It looked like a library. Books lined every wall, and afternoon sunlight streamed through tall windows that overlooked the city beyond. There was a comfortable leather sofa rather than harsh wooden chairs. Judge stood beside her desk, her black robes removed, revealing a simple navy dress underneath. Without the formal attire, she looked almost human, almost approachable. "Sarah, thank you for coming," Judge said gently. "Please sit down. You can bring Max with you." Sarah settled onto the sofa, Max curling at her feet. The judge sat in a chair across from her, angling her body towards Sarah rather than sitting behind her intimidating desk. It was a deliberate choice designed to minimize the power imbalance. "I want you to understand something very clearly," Judge began, her voice soft but firm. "What you say in this room is confidential. This conversation is off the record. I'm not asking you to testify. I'm asking you, as a person who cares about you, to help me understand what's happening in your life. Can you do that?" Sarah nodded slowly, her fingers tangled in Max's fur. "The silence you've been experiencing, when you can't speak to your mother, that's not something you're choosing, is it?" Sarah shook her head vigorously. Tears began to form in her eyes. "Can you try to describe what it feels like?" Sarah took a shaky breath. For a long moment, nothing came out. Her mouth opened and closed like a fish struggling out of water. Then, slowly, words began to emerge, fractured, hesitant, but real. "It's like my throat closes up," Sarah whispered. "Like someone is squeezing my neck from the inside. When Mom starts talking in that voice, that specific voice, my chest gets tight. My heart starts beating really fast, and the words they won't come. I want to say something, but my body won't let me." Judge was making detailed notes, but she did so without looking at Sarah, understanding that direct eye contact might make the girl feel more scrutinized. "That sounds terrifying. How long has this been happening?" "About 6 months. It started after Mom said something really bad about Dad. She was on the phone with her sister, and she didn't know I was listening. She said that Dad was poisoning me against her. She said he was brainwashing me. She said if I didn't start choosing sides, she would have no choice but to take me away from him permanently and get me into intensive therapy to deprogram me." The judge's pen stopped moving. She said those words to her sister, knowing you were listening. I don't think she knew I was listening, Sarah said. But after that conversation, something broke in my head. I realized that no matter what I did, no matter how I felt, I was going to hurt someone. If I loved Dad, Mom would say I was being brainwashed. If I agreed with Mom, I'd be betraying Dad. I couldn't win. So my body just shut down. And when did the selective mutism specifically start? The next time I saw Mom, she asked me how my week was and I tried to answer, but the words got stuck. My throat wouldn't work. She got frustrated with me. She said I was being deliberately difficult, that I was trying to punish her, but I wasn't, I just couldn't. Max's ears perked up slightly, as if he was tuned in to the emotional frequency of Sarah's words. He pressed more firmly against her leg. Tell me about the things your mother has said about your father, Judge asked carefully. Sarah's entire body tensed. She says he doesn't really love me. She says he only pretends to care about me so he can hurt her through me. She says he's selfish and manipulative, she says. She says the reason she stayed with him so long was because she was afraid of what he would do to me if she left. Sarah's voice cracked. But he's never done anything wrong. He's kind. He's patient. He listens to me. But Mom keeps saying he's this terrible person, and I keep thinking, what if she's right? What if I'm being fooled? What if I'm a bad person for loving him? Tears were streaming down Sarah's face now. Judge reached across and offered her a box of tissues. Sarah, I want to ask you something very important. When your mother speaks about your father in those ways, does she ever ask you to choose between them? Yes, all the time. She says things like, you know I'm the one who's always been there for you, or you can tell me if Dad has ever been inappropriate. She makes me feel like if I don't completely side with her, I'm betraying her. But if I side with her, I feel like I'm betraying Dad. It's like she's making me carry a weight that's too heavy, and the weight just keeps getting heavier and heavier. Judge was writing furiously now, her expression grave. Has your mother ever told you that you couldn't see your father? Not exactly, but she suggested it. She says things like, maybe it would be better if you didn't see him for a while, or I'm not sure your father is a safe person for you to be around. But then she acts like she's being so reasonable about the visitations. She makes it seem like she's the victim, like she's sacrificing her feelings for mine. Sarah, this is a mental health term, but do you know what parental alienation means? Sarah shook her head. It's when one parent tries to damage a child's relationship with the other parent by speaking negatively about them, often in ways that aren't truthful or that twist the truth. What you're describing, your mother repeatedly telling you negative things about your father, asking you to choose sides, making you feel guilty for loving him. These are classic signs of parental alienation. And the result is what you're experiencing. Anxiety so severe that your body physically prevents you from communicating. Sarah's eyes widened. So, it's not my fault I'm not crazy. You're not crazy at all. You're having a very normal response to an abnormal situation. Your nervous system is protecting you from overwhelming emotional pain. Your body has developed selective mutism, because it's literally the only way it knows how to protect you from the impossible choice your mother is forcing you to make. Sarah's breathing became less panicked. She looked down at Max, and the dog seemed to sense the shift in her emotional state. He lifted his head and licked her hand gently. Tell me about Max, Judge said. How did he come into your life? Dad adopted him about 8 months ago. He said he thought I could use a friend. I didn't really want a dog at first. I was dealing with the divorce stuff and I was angry all the time. But Max was different. He never judged me. He never asked me to explain myself. When I was having panic attacks, he would just lay next to me and press his body against mine. And somehow, his presence made the panic more manageable. It was like he was telling me that I wasn't alone. And Max is particularly helpful when you're anxious about your mother. Yes. When I know I'm about to see Mom, Max stays really close to me. It's like he knows. And when Mom starts talking in that certain tone, Max presses against me even harder. It's like he's creating a physical barrier between me and her words. It sounds crazy, but it helps. It grounds me. It reminds me that I'm safe, even when everything else feels unsafe. Judge leaned back in her chair, processing everything she'd heard. Sarah, I need you to understand something. What your mother is doing is not okay. Deliberately alienating a child from a loving parent, using emotional manipulation, forcing a child to choose sides. These are forms of emotional abuse. Your selective mutism is not a character flaw or a mental illness. It's evidence. It's your body's way of telling us that something is deeply wrong in your relationship with your mother. Sarah's eyes filled with fresh tears, but this time they seemed different, not tears of despair, but tears of recognition. Someone finally understood. What happens now? Sarah asked quietly. Judge's expression hardened with determination. Now I make sure you're protected. Now I make sure that your comes first. And now I make sure that Max remains with you, because that dog understands something about your emotional needs that goes beyond what most therapists could ever provide. As if on cue, Max lifted his head and made direct eye contact with Judge, an intense, almost human gaze that seemed to communicate, "Thank you for understanding. Thank you for seeing her. Thank you for protecting her." Judge felt something shift in her chest. This dog wasn't just a pet. This dog was a witness to truth. And the truth was about to reshape this entire case. Judge's decision to investigate Max's background was unconventional, but by this point in the case, she'd already moved well beyond conventional thinking. She instructed her clerk to contact the animal shelter where Max had been adopted and request complete records, vaccination history, behavioral assessments, adoption documentation, and any notes from his previous ownership. What arrived 3 hours later was a file that would prove crucial to understanding the extraordinary bond between Sarah and Max. Max had been purchased 6 years earlier by Dr. Vance, a retired clinical psychologist who specialized in trauma treatment. According to the shelter's documentation, Dr. Vance had specifically sought out a golden retriever puppy and had him professionally trained as an emotional support animal. The training had cost over $15,000 and had been conducted by one of the most prestigious animal behaviorists in the region, someone who worked exclusively with therapy and service animals. Judge called the shelter director, a woman named who remembered Max vividly. Dr. Vance was extraordinary, explained over the phone. She didn't just want a pet. She wanted an animal that could help her clients. She ran a private trauma therapy practice, and she believed that animals could facilitate healing in ways that traditional therapy sometimes couldn't. Max was trained to recognize emotional distress, to provide deep pressure stimulation, to create a calming presence. He was essentially a four-legged therapist. What happened to Dr. Vance? Judge asked. She passed away unexpectedly about 2 years ago. A stroke, I believe. Her family didn't know what to do with Max. They couldn't care for him properly, and they couldn't afford to keep him in the lifestyle Dr. Vance had provided. So they surrendered him to us about 18 months ago. And he was adopted by James Mitchell approximately 1 year ago. Yes, Mr. Mitchell came in asking for a dog with a calm temperament, one that was good with anxious individuals. He mentioned his daughter was going through a difficult time. I remembered Max immediately. I knew he'd been specifically trained to work with people experiencing trauma and anxiety. I thought it might be a good match, though Mr. Mitchell couldn't have known how well-trained Max actually was. Max spent about 2 weeks here, and I have to say, he was remarkably patient and gentle with every person who interacted with him. After the call ended, Judge sat back and pulled up the file on Dr. Vance. A quick internet search revealed that Dr. Vance had been a highly respected therapist who'd published several papers on animal-assisted therapy for trauma survivors. One of her papers was titled Canine Emotional Recognition and Human Nervous System Regulation, The Science Behind the Bond. Judge read the abstract. This paper explores the neurobiological mechanisms through which canine companions facilitate emotional regulation in trauma survivors. We present evidence that dogs trained to recognize human emotional distress can significantly reduce anxiety symptoms, lower cortisol levels, and facilitate nervous system regulation through deep pressure stimulation and sustained physical contact. The judge realized she was reading the scientific explanation for what she'd witnessed in the courtroom: Max's uncanny ability to sense Sarah's distress and respond with precisely calibrated physical intervention. She requested the full paper and read it carefully. Dr. Vance's research documented how dogs could learn to recognize the microexpressions, scent changes, and physiological cues that indicated anxiety or panic in humans. Trained properly, these dogs could anticipate emotional crises before they fully manifested and could provide grounding techniques that helped stabilize a person's nervous system. What fascinated Judge most was a passage near the end. Perhaps the most remarkable aspect of canine emotional support is the dog's apparent understanding of human suffering. Dogs are not simply performing trained behaviors. They appear to genuinely comprehend that their human companion is experiencing distress and that their presence provides comfort. The bond between a trained support animal and its human is not merely behavioral. It is deeply emotional and profoundly therapeutic. Judge made the decision to contact Dr. Vance's family. After searching public records, she found a phone number for Dr. Vance's daughter, Vance Mitchell, who lived in another state. Answered on the second ring, surprised to hear from a judge about her mother's former dog. "Your Honor, I'm not sure how I can help, but I'll try," said hesitantly. "I'm calling because Max is currently at the center of a custody case," Judge explained. "I need to understand exactly how much training he received and whether his therapeutic capabilities are genuine or coincidental." "Oh, Max," said her voice softening. "My mother loved that dog more than anything. She spent so much money training him, but she believed it was worth every penny. She used him with her most traumatized clients, people with PTSD, abuse survivors, children dealing with complex family situations. She documented everything carefully." "Did your mother believe that Max could recognize specific emotional triggers in people?" "Absolutely. She had notebooks full of observations. Max could apparently detect cortisol level changes through scent, could recognize anxiety patterns through body language, and could somehow understand when someone was approaching an emotional crisis. Mom theorized that Max had been specially attuned to human suffering through his training. She called him her emotional seismograph. He could feel the tremors before the earthquake happened." Judge's heart was racing. "When your mother passed, what happened to Max?" There was a pause. His voice became thick with emotion. That was actually one of my biggest regrets. We were grieving, overwhelmed, and we didn't know how to care for a dog that had been so specialized. We thought a shelter would be best, but honestly, we should have done more research. We should have found someone who understood what Max was. He ended up at that shelter for weeks before someone adopted him." "I'm going to tell you something that might interest you," Judge said carefully. "Max was adopted by a single father who has an anxious teenage daughter. That daughter has developed selective mutism, an anxiety disorder that prevents her from speaking in triggering situations. Max appears to be providing her with exactly the kind of emotional support your mother trained him to provide. In fact, Max made a gesture in my courtroom that demonstrated a level of emotional intelligence that I've never witnessed in an animal. Began to cry. That's exactly what Mom would have hoped for. She always said that Max's purpose was to find the person who needed him most. She believed in fate. She believed that Max would end up with someone who truly understood his value. Your mother sounds like she was an extraordinary person." "She was, and I think Max was her greatest achievement, not because of the training but because of the love she poured into him. She didn't just train him to recognize emotions, she taught him to care about people. She taught him that his purpose was to ease human suffering." After the call ended, Judge sat quietly in her chambers, processing everything she'd learned. Max wasn't just a coincidentally well-behaved dog who happened to bond with an anxious girl. Max was a specifically trained therapeutic animal whose entire life had been dedicated to healing trauma survivors. And somehow, through a series of circumstances that could only be described as providential, he'd ended up exactly where he needed to be, with a girl whose trauma matched his expertise perfectly. Judge pulled up the courtroom footage again and watched the moment when Max pressed his body against the witness stand and locked eyes with Sarah. Now, understanding Max's background, she could see it differently. It wasn't just a dog comforting a girl. It was a trained emotional support animal recognizing a person in crisis and providing precisely calibrated intervention. She made notes for her ruling. Max is not merely a pet or comfort item. Max is a therapeutic tool specifically trained to support individuals with anxiety and trauma-related conditions. Separation from Max would constitute interference with Sarah's essential medical psychological support system. Judge stood and walked to her window, looking out over the city. Somewhere in those streets, a girl who couldn't speak was being held up by a dog who understood suffering in a way most humans never could. The judge made a silent vow. She would protect that bond with everything in her power. The courtroom had grown increasingly restless during the extended recess. Journalists whispered among themselves. Court observers checked their phones. The tension had become almost palpable, as if everyone sensed that something monumental was about to unfold. When the bailiff finally announced that court was reconvening, the gallery fell silent with an almost religious reverence. Judge entered from her private chamber, and everyone immediately recognized that something fundamental had changed. The judge's expression was no longer neutral or judiciously measured. Instead, her face carried the weight of profound realization, the look of someone who'd uncovered a truth that demanded immediate action. She settled into her chair and addressed the courtroom without preamble. Before we proceed, I need to make an official statement regarding my understanding of this case. I have reviewed additional documentation, consulted with medical professionals, and conducted supplementary interviews. My initial interpretation of Sarah Mitchell's condition was incomplete and, I believe, significantly flawed. Shifted uncomfortably in her seat, James leaned forward, tension radiating from his body. The court initially interpreted Sarah's selective mutism as evidence of depression, emotional dysfunction, or possible behavioral manipulation. Judge continued, her voice steady and authoritative. I was wrong. I now understand that Sarah's inability to speak in her mother's presence is not a psychiatric disorder requiring discipline or intensive maternal intervention. It is a symptom, a manifestation of anxiety so severe that it physically prevents vocal communication. The judge paused, letting that statement sink in. Selective mutism is a recognized anxiety disorder, often triggered by trauma, overwhelming stress, or emotional abuse. The individual experiencing selective mutism is not choosing silence. The body is enforcing silence as a protective mechanism against unbearable psychological pain. Judge looked directly at Ms. Mitchell. I have reviewed your testimony carefully, and I have also reviewed the psychological evaluation that was submitted to this court 6 weeks ago, but apparently not thoroughly analyzed. That evaluation noted that your daughter exhibits selective mutism specifically in your presence but speaks fluently with her father, with peers, and in other environments. This is not coincidental. This is diagnostic. His face flushed. Your Honor, I don't understand what you're. You will listen, Judge said, her tone brooking no interruption. During this recess, I have spoken with the clinical psychologist who conducted Sarah's evaluation. I have reviewed medical literature on selective mutism, and I have spoken privately with Sarah herself in a confidential conversation designed to understand the root cause of her condition rather than to judge it. The courtroom was absolutely silent now. Sarah felt tears forming in her eyes. Max pressed his body more firmly against her leg, as if he understood that something pivotal was occurring. Sarah has disclosed that her selective mutism developed following a conversation, which she overheard, between you and your sister, Ms. Mitchell. During that conversation, you described your daughter as being brainwashed and poisoned by her father. You discussed the possibility of subjecting her to deprogramming therapy. These are not casual parental concerns. These are statements consistent with what mental health professionals term parental alienation. Judge stood up, and her physical action commanded absolute attention. Parental alienation occurs when one parent deliberately attempts to damage a child's relationship with the other parent through negative statements, manipulation, and emotional coercion. It often involves forcing a child to choose between parents, an impossible choice that creates profound psychological distress. She walked slowly across the front of the courtroom, her robes trailing behind her. What Sarah has been experiencing is the anxiety response to an impossible situation. Her mother repeatedly tells her that her father is dangerous, manipulative, and untrustworthy. Meanwhile, Sarah's lived experience with her father is that he is kind, patient, and loving. This cognitive dissonance, this fundamental conflict between what she's being told and what she's experiencing, creates overwhelming anxiety. Judge returned to her seat and addressed both parents directly. When a child's nervous system is exposed to this level of emotional conflict repeatedly, it begins to malfunction. The child experiences panic responses that they cannot control. In Sarah's case, her body has developed selective mutism, an inability to speak in the presence of the person causing the anxiety. This is not a personality flaw. This is evidence of trauma. She turned to specifically, Ms. Mitchell, your daughter's silence is not stubbornness. Her silence is not manipulation. Her silence is a cry for help, a wordless plea for someone to understand that she is drowning in the impossible position you have placed her in. And the most tragic aspect of this situation is that you have interpreted her silence as evidence that she needs you more, when in fact her silence is evidence that she needs protection from you. Stood up abruptly. This is outrageous. I have never done anything but try to protect my daughter. You will sit down, Judge said, her voice cutting through the courtroom like steel. You have not been given permission to speak. Sat, her face mottled with anger and indignation. Judge continued, I want to address something else that has become apparent through this case. Sarah has been accompanied throughout these proceedings by her dog, Max. I initially permitted the dog's presence as an accommodation for emotional support. However, through investigation, I have discovered that this dog is not merely a pet. Max was specifically trained by a clinical psychologist named Dr. Vance to function as an emotional support animal for trauma survivors. The judge pulled out her documentation. Max received over $15,000 in specialized training to recognize emotional distress, to provide grounding techniques, and to facilitate nervous system regulation in individuals experiencing anxiety or trauma. When Dr. Vance passed away, Max was eventually adopted by Mr. James Mitchell, who, whether consciously or intuitively, selected a dog whose expertise was precisely aligned with his daughter's needs. Judge looked toward Sarah and Max. What I witnessed in this courtroom earlier today was not merely a child and a dog bonding. What I witnessed was a trained therapeutic animal recognizing a person in acute emotional distress and providing precisely calibrated intervention. The dog placed its body against Sarah in a gesture of grounding. The dog made direct eye contact, communicating, "You are not alone. You will survive this." That is not coincidence. That is the fruition of years of training, combined with genuine emotional intelligence. She turned back to address the full courtroom. I have spent 23 years on the bench. I have presided over hundreds of family law cases, and I can say with absolute certainty that I have never witnessed a more compelling example of a therapeutic bond between human and animal. That dog understands Sarah's emotional needs with a sophistication that rivals, perhaps exceeds, what many human therapists could provide. Judge removed her glasses and rubbed her eyes, a gesture that conveyed the weight of what she was about to say. This case has taught me something profound. Sometimes the truth is not spoken in words. Sometimes the truth is communicated through silence. Sarah's silence has told me everything I need to know about her environment, her relationships, and what she needs to heal. She looked directly at Sarah. Your silence, young lady, has not gone unheard. I have heard it, I understand it, and I am going to make sure that you are protected. Then Judge addressed the courtroom with finality in her voice. This court is about to issue a ruling that reflects not what is easiest or most conventional, but what is actually in the best interest of this child's mental health and psychological. This ruling will be based on medical evidence, psychological expertise, and the most compelling testimony this courtroom has heard. The silent communication between a traumatized girl and the dog who understands her suffering better than anyone else. She looked at her notes. But before I issue that ruling, I want both parents to understand something. Family court exists to protect children, not to facilitate parental conflict, not to allow parents to weaponize their children against each other. Family court exists for one reason, the of the child. And in this case, that child's has been significantly compromised by the actions of one parent. Judge's expression hardened. The court is about to make decisions that will reshape this family's future, and those decisions will be based on one simple principle. Sarah's mental health must be protected at all costs. That is my obligation. That is my duty. And that is what I am about to do. She paused, letting the gravity of her words settle over the courtroom like fog. We will take a brief recess. When we reconvene, I will issue my final ruling. As the bailiff called for the recess, Judge's eyes met Sarah's. The judge gave the girl the smallest nod, a gesture that communicated, I see you, I believe you, you will be okay. And at that moment, Sarah understood that someone finally understood. Someone finally saw past the silence to the truth beneath it. When court reconvened, the gallery was packed beyond capacity. Word had spread through the courthouse that Judge was about to issue an unprecedented ruling in a custody case involving a dog and selective mutism. Journalists had arrived with cameras. Law students sat in the back, understanding they were about to witness something historically significant in family law. The tension in the courtroom was electric, almost suffocating. Judge took her seat and immediately addressed the court. I want to state for the record that this ruling is based on comprehensive medical evidence, psychological expertise, and the best interest of the minor child, Sarah Mitchell. This court has determined that the primary concern in this case is not parental rights or preferences, but rather the mental health and psychological of a traumatized adolescent. She opened the thick file containing her written decision. The court finds that Sarah Mitchell has been diagnosed with selective mutism, a recognized anxiety disorder that manifests as an inability to speak in specific triggering situations. The diagnosis is not indicative of depression, behavioral dysfunction, or emotional manipulation. Rather, selective mutism is recognized by the American Psychiatric Association as evidence of significant anxiety triggered by environmental stressors. Judge looked directly at. The court further finds that the primary trigger for Sarah's anxiety is her maternal parent. Specifically, the minor has been exposed to repeated negative statements about her father, has been placed in an untenable position of choosing between her parents, and has been subjected to what mental health professionals term parental alienation. These actions constitute emotional abuse. Attorney stood to object, but Judge held up her hand. The court has reviewed all testimony, all psychological evaluations, and has conducted supplementary interviews with both the minor and qualified mental health professionals. This determination is supported by comprehensive evidence. The judge continued. The minor exhibits clear physiological markers of anxiety in the maternal parent's presence: elevated heart rate, shallow breathing, constricted pupils, and most significantly, the development of selective mutism. Conversely, the minor demonstrates normal emotional functioning, verbal fluency, and psychological stability in the paternal parent's presence and in other environments. This pattern is diagnostic. She paused, letting the gravity of her words settle over the courtroom. Therefore, The court issues the following ruling. Judge adjusted her glasses and read from her prepared decision. Custody of Sarah Mitchell is hereby awarded to James Mitchell, with primary residence established at his residence on Maple Street. The minor will remain in the paternal household for the duration of her minority. James's face flooded with relief. Sarah's shoulders relaxed slightly, though she remained rigid with tension, understanding that the ruling wasn't complete. However, Judge continued, and the word hung in the air like a thunderclap, visitation with the maternal parent is permitted under the following conditions. All visitations will be supervised by a court-appointed family mediator. The maternal parent will be required to complete a comprehensive psychological evaluation by a court-approved clinician. The maternal parent will be required to complete family therapy focusing on parental alienation and emotional abuse prevention. The maternal parent will be required to complete a parenting education program, specifically addressing healthy communication and age-appropriate boundaries. Judge looked at sternly. Visitation will be reinstated only after these requirements have been completed, and the court has determined that it is psychologically safe for the minor to resume contact with the maternal parent. Until that time, all contact will be supervised. His face turned white. Your Honor, this is... I am not finished, Judge interrupted. There is one more critical aspect of this ruling. The courtroom fell absolutely silent. Everyone sensed that something extraordinary was about to be said. The court recognizes that the minor, Sarah Mitchell, has developed an exceptionally strong therapeutic bond with a canine companion named Max. This dog was specifically trained by a licensed clinical psychologist to function as an emotional support animal for trauma survivors. The court has determined that this dog's presence in the minor's life is not ancillary to her. It is essential to her mental health and psychological recovery. Judge leaned forward, her voice becoming even more authoritative. Therefore, the court hereby issues an unprecedented ruling. Max is recognized by this court as an essential emotional support animal integral to Sarah Mitchell's mental health treatment and psychological. Max will remain permanently with Sarah Mitchell. Any attempt by any party to separate this minor from this animal will constitute interference with the minor's essential medical treatment and will result in contempt of court charges. The courtroom erupted. Journalists began talking excitedly into their phones. Law students frantically wrote notes. Even some court officers exchanged surprised glances. Judge continued without pause. Furthermore, the court determines that the bond between this minor and this animal transcends typical pet ownership. The dog has demonstrated emotional intelligence, behavioral sophistication, and therapeutic capability that rivals professional psychological intervention. The court recognizes and honors this bond and will protect it with the full force of judicial authority. She looked directly at Sarah. Young lady, I want you to understand that your silence has been heard. Your anxiety has been recognized. Your trauma has been validated, and your needs will be protected by this court. Sarah's eyes filled with tears. Max, sensing the emotional shift, rose to his feet and pressed his entire body against her leg. The court also recognizes, Judge added, that this minor's father, James Mitchell, demonstrated wisdom and compassion in adopting an animal whose therapeutic expertise aligns precisely with his daughter's needs. Whether this was conscious or intuitive, it was the right decision. The court commends Mr. Mitchell for prioritizing his daughter's emotional. James's eyes glistened with tears. He reached over and squeezed Sarah's shoulder gently. Finally, Judge said, her voice becoming almost reverent, the court wants to acknowledge something that transcends law and enters the realm of the miraculous. The bond between human and animal represented in this courtroom is a testament to the power of unconditional love and emotional attunement. This dog does not judge. This dog does not manipulate. This dog simply understands suffering and responds with compassion. Perhaps we as humans could learn from that example. Judge removed her glasses and looked directly at Sarah one final time. You are not broken, young lady. You are not sick. You are a resilient, intelligent, compassionate person who has survived something that would break many adults. Your silence was not weakness, it was survival, and now you have been given permission to heal. She addressed the entire courtroom. This ruling is final and effective immediately. Ms. Mitchell will comply with all court-mandated requirements. Mr. Mitchell will maintain primary custody, and Max will remain with Sarah Mitchell, protected under the authority of this court. Court is adjourned. As Judge stood to leave, the courtroom erupted in activity. But Sarah remained still, processing what had just happened. Her father had been awarded primary custody. Her mother had been ordered into therapy. And Max, her lifeline, her emotional anchor, had been legally recognized and protected. Slowly, Sarah stood on shaky legs. Her father embraced her, holding her as tears streamed down both their faces. Max remained at her side, his presence the steady, grounding force it had always been. As they prepared to leave the courtroom, Sarah paused. She looked down at Max, and without thinking, without planning, she performed the gesture that had become their private language. She placed her hand on Max's head and nodded with clear, definitive intent. It was their signal. I'm okay. We survived this. We're going to be okay. And then, for the first time in 18 months, Sarah smiled. It was a small smile, tentative and fragile, but it was real. It was genuine. It was the smile of someone who had finally been heard, finally been believed, finally been protected. Judge watched from her elevated position as Sarah and Max left the courtroom together, the girl's hand resting gently on the dog's head. The judge understood that she'd witnessed something rare and profound, not just a legal victory, but a moment of genuine justice and healing. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed, but James guided Sarah and Max away from the cameras, protecting his daughter's privacy. They walked together toward the parking lot, three beings bound by love, trauma, survival, and an unbreakable bond. That evening, Sarah sat in her father's living room with Max curled at her feet. The house felt different somehow, safer, more solid, more like home. She picked up her phone and opened her notes app. She began to write. Today, a judge understood my silence. Today, someone finally heard what I couldn't say with words. Today, I learned that speaking up, even without words, matters. And today, I learned that love and loyalty, embodied in the form of a golden retriever, can be more powerful than legal arguments or courtroom testimony. Sarah paused, then continued typing. Max saved my life. Not dramatically, not with heroic actions, but through his quiet presence, his unwavering loyalty, and his extraordinary ability to understand my pain. He taught me that sometimes the most important conversations happen in silence. Sometimes the most powerful truths are communicated through a touch, a look, a presence that says, "You are not alone. I understand. I believe you. You will survive this." She looked down at Max, who gazed back at her with those intelligent, understanding eyes. Sarah placed her hand on his head and nodded, their sacred gesture, and the dog's tail thumped softly against the floor. Outside, the world continued on, unaware of the extraordinary justice that had been served in a small courtroom. But inside that house, a girl who had lost her voice had begun to find it again, not through speaking, but through being finally, truly heard. And sometimes that's all anyone really needs: to be heard, to be believed, to be protected, to be loved unconditionally. Max understood that truth in ways that went beyond language, and because of that understanding, Sarah would heal. The end.